Benito Mussolini. A dead man hangs upside down at a petrol station in Milan. Beside him, his mistress. Below, a furious crowd gathers, kicking, spitting, throwing stones. This was Benito Mussolini, and the location was no accident. Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascist forces had displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans the previous August. Now, the dictator hung where the resistance once had. For 20 years, Mussolini had transformed dictatorship into spectacle. The March on Rome, the invasion of Ethiopia, the promise of a reborn Roman Empire. But behind the uniforms, the salutes, and the thunderous speeches, Italy was being dragged into wars it could not fight. Its armies faltered in Greece, they collapsed in North Africa, and in every theater where victory required more than propaganda, the illusion began to break. By 1943, even Mussolini's own Grand Council had turned against him. They stripped him of power. The king ordered his arrest. The man who had ruled Italy through fear was suddenly a prisoner of the nation he claimed to command. Germany rescued him, but not as an equal. Hitler installed Mussolini as the head of a puppet state in northern Italy, governing only at the pleasure of the regime he had once helped inspire. By April 1945, that final illusion collapsed. Mussolini fled towards Switzerland, hidden inside a retreating German convoy, wearing a German overcoat in a desperate attempt to disappear. But the partisans stopped the column. They searched the vehicles, and they found him. On April 28th, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were taken away and shot. Their bodies were driven to Milan, then hung upside down at Piazzale Loreto. The square that had once displayed the bodies of murdered partisans now displayed the dictator who had ordered them killed, Adolf Hitler. Reports of Mussolini's fate reportedly reached the bunker. The mutilated body, the furious crowd, the dictator hanging upside down for all to see. Hitler was determined it would not happen to him. By late April 1945, the man who had commanded the largest military machine in European history was hiding beneath the ruins of his own capital. Above him, Berlin was collapsing. Soviet artillery shook the ceiling. Concrete trembled. Dust fell through the underground corridors. The Reich Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was only 12 years old. For most of those 12 years, Hitler had held absolute power. Since 1934, he had stood as Germany's supreme authority, Führer, Chancellor, Supreme Commander. He had ordered the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. He had authorized the machinery of the Holocaust. Once, his authority stretched across almost an entire continent. Now, it extended only to a handful of underground rooms. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun inside the bunker. One day later, they withdrew to his private quarters. Behind the closed door, Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their aides wrapped the bodies, carried them through the bunker corridors, and brought them into the Chancellery Garden. There, under Soviet bombardment, they poured petrol over the corpses and set them on fire, just as Hitler had ordered. Soviet forces later recovered fragments of jawbone and dental work from the ruins. His dentist's assistants confirmed the match. The empire that was meant to last 1,000 years survived for 12, and the remains of the man who tried to rule the world fit inside a box. Reinhard Heydrich. Hitler died behind meters of concrete. Reinhard Heydrich rode through occupied Prague in an open car. That decision would cost him his life. Heydrich was one of the most feared officials in all of Europe. As head of the Reich Security Main Office, he oversaw the Gestapo. He directed the killing operations of the Einsatzgruppen, and he chaired the Wannsee Conference, where the machinery of mass murder was coordinated with chilling precision. In 1941, Heydrich became acting Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He ruled through terror, yet despite repeated warnings, he refused an armored escort. Every morning, Heydrich traveled through Prague along the same familiar route. On May 27, 1942, two Czechoslovak agents trained in Britain were waiting for him. As his Mercedes slowed at a tight curve, they struck. One man raised his weapon. It jammed. For a moment, the assassination appeared to have failed. Then the second man threw a modified grenade. The explosion tore through the car. Shrapnel and fragments of the vehicle's upholstery were driven deep into Heydrich's body. He stepped from the damaged Mercedes, drew his pistol, and then collapsed. After surgery, Heydrich appeared to recover. For several days, it seemed he might survive. Then, infection set in. On June 4th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died. The Nazi response was merciless. In retaliation, they destroyed the village of Lidis. Its men were executed. Its women and children were deported. But the final irony remained. The man who commanded one of Europe's most feared security systems had been killed on a route he traveled every morning, inside a car he refused to armor, by two men with only one working weapon. Hideki Tojo. Heydrich never had the chance to choose his own death. Hideki Tojo did, but the bullet missed. As Japan's prime minister during the attack on Pearl Harbor and much of the Pacific War, Tojo held extraordinary power: prime minister, war minister, army chief of staff. He presided over Japan's military expansion and over the systematic mistreatment of prisoners and occupied populations. But after Japan surrendered, the power disappeared. On September 11th, 1945, American forces arrived to arrest him. Military police surrounded his house. Inside, Tojo prepared to die. He had reportedly asked a physician to mark the location of his heart with charcoal. Then he pressed a pistol against his chest when fired. The bullet entered his body, but it missed his heart. American medics rushed inside, stabilized him, and kept him alive. The death he had chosen would not be the death he received. Tojo recovered. Then he was brought before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He stood trial. He was convicted. And on December 23rd, 1948, Hideki Tojo was hanged. He had prepared the method. He had chosen the moment. He had aimed for the organ that would end his life instantly. But the bullet failed to reach its target, and history chose the ending for him. Joseph Goebbels. Tojo survived his attempt to die. Joseph Goebbels ensured that he, his wife, and their 6 children would not. As Reich Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels controlled the voice of the Nazi state. From 1933 onward, radio, film, newspapers, and mass rallies carried the message he constructed. He manufactured consent, he turned lies into spectacle, and he ensured that no competing voice was allowed to survive. Goebbels remained devoted to Hitler even after the state around them had ceased to function. The armies were collapsing, the cities were burning, the government existed only inside a bunker. Yet in Hitler's final will, Goebbels was named Reich Chancellor. He held the title for a single day over a government with no functioning army, no meaningful territory, and almost no audience left to command. On May 1st, 1945, Goebbels and his wife, Magda, turned first to their 6 children. The children were poisoned inside the bunker. Then Goebbels and Magda walked into the Chancellery Garden. There, they died by poison, gunshot, or both. Their bodies were partially burned among the ruins of the regime they had served. For 12 years, Josef Goebbels had worked to ensure that the Nazi message reached every ear in Germany, every broadcast, every newspaper, every cinema screen, every rally. But in the end, the microphones were silent, the crowds were gone, the government had vanished, and there was almost no one left to hear the final message. Hermann Goring. Goebbels died alongside the regime. Hermann Goring outlived it, long enough to face trial, hear his sentence, and still choose the final act. Once, Goring had stood among the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, commander of the Luftwaffe, president of the Reichstag, and Hitler's designated successor. But his influence weakened with every failed air campaign. The man who had promised German domination of the skies watched his air force slowly collapse. By April 1945, the regime was disintegrating. Believing Hitler could no longer govern, Goering attempted to assume leadership. Hitler answered with fury. He stripped Goering of every title and ordered his arrest. The designated successor had become a traitor in the eyes of the man who had once chosen him. Soon after, Goering surrendered to American forces. He was taken to Nuremberg, where he stood trial before the International Military Tribunal. The court found him guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. Goering requested to be executed by firing squad, a soldier's death. The tribunal refused. The method had been chosen. The date had been fixed. And on the night of October 15th, 1946, only hours before his scheduled execution, Goering placed a cyanide capsule between his teeth and crushed it. He died inside his cell. Letters were found beside him, including one addressed to the Allied Control Council. But one question remained. How had the cyanide capsule reached him? Despite searches, guards, and constant surveillance, the answer was never fully resolved. The court chose his verdict. It chose the method. It chose the hour. But Goering chose not to be there for it. Adolf Eichmann. Goring chose poison inside a prison. Adolf Eichmann chose something larger, a new name, a new continent, and 15 years of silence. Eichmann had organized the machinery of deportation, the trains, the schedules, the routes, the logistics that sent millions of Jews into ghettos, transit camps, and killing centers across Europe. He did not need to pull the trigger himself. He made certain the victims arrived. After the war, Eichmann disappeared. He escaped through Austria and Italy, carrying a Red Cross travel document under a false identity, Ricardo Clement. By 1950, he was living in Buenos Aires, far from Europe, far from the ruins, far from the crimes he believed he had left behind. For years, he lived in obscurity, a quiet house, an ordinary job, a stolen name, and silence. Then, a tip reached Israeli intelligence. Part of the information came through German prosecutor Fritz Bauer, a man who risked his career by secretly passing evidence to Mossad. He did not trust the West German judiciary to act. In May 1960, a Mossad team tracked Eichmann to a road outside Buenos Aires. They seized him, held him in secret, then placed him aboard an aircraft and carried him back across the ocean he had crossed to escape. In Jerusalem, Eichmann stood trial. The proceedings became a landmark in Holocaust remembrance. Survivors spoke, the evidence was presented, and the man who had once reduced millions of human beings to transport lists and timetables was forced to face the consequences of those orders. He was convicted, and on June 1st, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was hanged. After the execution, his body was cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea, beyond Israeli territorial waters. No grave, no shrine, no memorial, nothing that could become a place of honor. He crossed an ocean to disappear, and years later, he was carried back across it to be judged. Heinrich Himmler. Eichmann sustained his false identity for 15 years. Heinrich Himmler's lasted roughly 48 hours. As Reichsführer SS, Himmler commanded one of the most terrifying institutions in modern history: the SS, the Gestapo, the concentration camp system, and the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed German armies across occupied Europe. He controlled a parallel state, answerable primarily to Hitler himself. But as Germany approached defeat, Himmler began searching for a way to save himself. Without Hitler's knowledge, he secretly contacted the Western Allies, using the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte as an intermediary. Himmler imagined he could negotiate a separate peace and present himself as someone the Allies could still work with. But when Hitler learned of the betrayal, he erupted. Himmler was expelled from the Nazi Party, stripped of every position, and abandoned by the regime he had served. Without rank, uniform, or protection, Himmler attempted to disappear. He shaved his mustache, placed an eye patch over one eye, and carried forged papers under a new name, Heinrich Hitzinger. But the disguise did not last. On May 21st, 1945, British forces detained him at a checkpoint near Bremervörde. Within hours, he admitted who he really was. 2 days later, during a physical examination, a doctor attempted to inspect Himmler's mouth. That was when he acted. Hidden behind his teeth was a small glass capsule filled with cyanide. Himmler bit down. The capsule shattered. The poison entered his body, and within minutes, he was dead. He had once commanded the most feared security apparatus on the continent, but his final operational act was hiding a glass capsule behind his own teeth. Josef Mengele. Several men in this story chose poison, bullets, or fire. Josef Mengele chose distance, and it worked. At Auschwitz, Mengele stood on the selection ramp, watching prisoners arrive in crowded transport trains. With a gesture of his hand, he directed them left or right, forced labor, or immediate death. Thousands of lives were decided in seconds. Beyond the selection ramp, Mengele conducted experiments on prisoners, including children and twins. These were not acts of medicine, they were systematic torture, carried out beneath the appearance of scientific research. But when the war ended, Mengele did not stand trial. American forces briefly detained him, then released him. His name had not yet been fully connected to the crimes committed at Auschwitz. By the time investigators understood who they had allowed to walk away, he was already disappearing. Mengele fled first to Argentina, then Paraguay, then Brazil. He adopted new names, used forged documents, and relied on networks that helped former Nazis remain hidden. As the years passed, international searches intensified. Investigators followed rumors. Witnesses reported sightings. Authorities came close, but never close enough. Josef Mengele was never captured. Then, on February 7th, 1979, Mengele went swimming at a beach near Sao Paulo. There was no arrest team waiting, no courtroom, no witnesses from Auschwitz. While swimming, he suffered a stroke and drowned. The man hunted across continents died not under guard, but in warm water beneath a borrowed name. His remains were exhumed in 1985. Years later, DNA comparison with his son confirmed the identity. Josef Mengele had been dead for more than a decade. While the world was still searching for him, thousands entered Auschwitz under his authority. He decided who would work, who would suffer, and who would die immediately. Yet 34 years later, he died beyond the reach of any court. No verdict, no sentence, no moment of judgment, only distance, and an ending he never had to answer for. Rudolf Höss. Mengele never returned to Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss, the commandant who helped build it into a machinery of mass death, was brought back. Höss commanded Auschwitz from 1940 to 1943. Under his authority, the camp expanded from a prison complex into the largest extermination center of the Holocaust. Barracks multiplied, gas chambers were constructed, crematoria operated on an industrial scale, and mass murder became routine. In 1944, Höss returned to Auschwitz for one final operation, this time to supervise the deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews. Trains arrived relentlessly, day after day, week after week. Under the system Höss managed, more than 1 million people were killed at Auschwitz. He had overseen the camp as it became a symbol, not only of death, but of death organized with schedules, quotas, and administrative precision. After the war, Höss disappeared. He hid near Flensburg, working as a farmhand under a false name. The former commandant of Auschwitz now presented himself as an ordinary laborer, but in March 1946, British forces found him. His location was reportedly revealed after his wife was interrogated. Höss was arrested. He testified at Nuremberg, describing the killing system he had once commanded. Then he was extradited to Poland. In Warsaw, Rudolf Höss stood trial. He was convicted and sentenced to death. But the execution would not take place inside an ordinary prison. On April 16, 1947, Höss was taken back to Auschwitz. Gallows had been erected inside the former camp, only meters from the crematorium he had once supervised. There, at the center of the machinery he had helped create, Rudolf Höss was hanged. 10 men, 10 different endings. Some were executed before crowds, some died in bunkers, prison cells, or at roadside checkpoints. Some were hunted across continents, captured and dragged into courtrooms. Some swallowed poison, and for some, it worked. One survived his own bullet, only to be hanged years later. Another drowned decades after the war, without ever facing trial. But power collapsed for every one of them. Dictators lost their regimes. Commanders lost their armies. Men who once controlled police states, deportations, and concentration camps were reduced to prisoners, fugitives, and borrowed names. The uniforms disappeared. The titles became meaningless. The systems they commanded collapsed around them. And the men who once decided the fate of millions could no longer control their own. But justice did not arrive equally. Some were executed, some chose the method of their death, some were captured after years in hiding, and one escaped every courtroom until death reached him naturally. Their endings were different, but the collapse was the same. The power vanished, the protection disappeared, and history was left to decide what remained. If you want more hidden stories from history, subscribe.